Ashford, England, August of 1943. A woman lies on a hospital bed in the county of Kent. She is 34 years old. She is eating too little to survive, and she knows it. And she continues anyway. Outside the window, Europe is at war. In occupied France, the population survives on rations. The German occupation has reduced to the bare minimum. People are hungry because a military machine has decided they should be. This woman is hungry because she believes she must be. She will be dead in 8 days. Her name is Simone Weil. In her lifetime, almost no one outside a small circle of French intellectuals has heard of her. After her death, Albert Camus will call her the only great spirit of our time. T.S. Eliot will write that she represents a kind of genius that appears once in a generation. But tonight she is 34 years old and dying in a way that no one will ever fully explain. And the questions she spent her life asking will still be unanswered 80 years later. This is her story. It begins in Paris, with a girl who decided that a life spent looking away from suffering was not a life worth living, and it ends here, in this room, with a woman who lived that decision all the way to its conclusion. Settle in. Let the noise of the day fall away. Tonight we travel to one of the most uncompromising minds the 20th century produced. Back to Paris, in the winter of 1909. Chapter 1. The girl who argued with God before she knew his name. Paris, the winter of 1909. The 4th arrondissement, on a February morning, is a particular kind of cold. The cold of a city built for beauty rather than warmth, where the light comes off the pale stone of the buildings at an angle that is magnificent in summer and unforgiving in winter. The fires in the apartment grates are never quite adequate. The people who live there wear their coats indoors longer than they admit to visitors. Into this specific cold, on the 3rd of February 1909, a girl was born to Bernard Weil and Salomea Reinherz Weil in their apartment in the 4th arrondissement. They named her Simone Adolphine Weil. Her father, Bernard, was a physician, quiet and precise, a man whose emotional warmth expressed itself primarily through the quality of his attention to the people in front of him. He received his daughter with the quiet affection of a man who did not yet know what he had received but who sensed, in the specific way of a doctor trained to notice things others miss, that it was something out of the ordinary. Her mother, Salomea, known to everyone as Mime, was a different kind of force. She was the organizing intelligence of the household, socially precise, emotionally exacting, possessed of the particular kind of love that expresses itself as an unrelenting standard. She adored her children in the way of someone who believed that the highest form of love was refusing to let them be less than they were capable of being. The Weil family was Jewish by origin and secular by conviction. Bernard and Mime had moved away from religious practice before their children were born. God was not a living question at the dinner table. The household ran on reason, on education, on the assumption that the examined life was organized around evidence and argument rather than faith. Simone would absorb all of this completely and then spend her adult life complicating every part of it. But before all of that, there was André. André Weil was born 3 years before Simone, in 1906, and from the earliest years of his childhood, it was clear to everyone who encountered him that he was something extraordinary. He was working through serious mathematics before most children had learned to read with fluency. By his early teens, he was operating at a level that made professional mathematicians stop and pay attention. He would go on to become one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, a founder of modern algebraic geometry, a man whose name appears in the histories of the field with the frequency reserved for people who change what a discipline is capable of imagining. Simone grew up inside this. She was not unintelligent. She was, by any fair measure, exceptionally so. She read with enormous appetite from very early on. She argued with adults in ways that made some of them uncomfortable and others quietly delighted. She had, from childhood, the quality that would define her entire intellectual life, a complete inability to accept an answer that did not fully satisfy her. If a teacher said that something was true, Simone wanted to know why it was true, and if the why did not hold up, she would say so, with a directness that the French educational system of the early 20th century was not designed to accommodate. But she was not André, and in a household where André's genius was simply a fact of the environment, as present and undeniable as the furniture, Simone grew up measuring herself against a standard she could not reach and did not know how to stop reaching for. Her biographer, Simone Petrement, who knew her personally and wrote the most thorough account of her life, published in French in 1973 and translated into English in 1976, records that the young Simone went through a period of profound despair in her early adolescence, around the age of 14, in which she seriously confronted the question of whether a life of what she considered second-rate intelligence was worth living at all, not in the dramatic sense that adults sometimes project onto adolescent unhappiness, in the cold, logical sense of someone who had decided that if she could not think clearly enough to contribute something real to human understanding, then the project of her existence was compromised at its foundation. What pulled her through was not reassurance from outside. Simone was not a person who responded to reassurance with much confidence, partly because she suspected it was rarely fully honest, and partly because she had already developed the habit of testing every proposition against reality rather than accepting it because someone kind had offered it. What pulled her through was a conclusion she reached on her own, through the sustained attention she would bring to every important question of her life. She decided that what mattered in the pursuit of truth was not the power of the mind, but the quality of its attention. The person who works through a difficult problem with limited ability but total honesty contributes something genuine. The person with great ability and incomplete attention contributes something less than their capacity suggests. This sounds, stated plainly, like a comfortable thought that a struggling student might reach for to feel better. In Simone's case, it became the organizing principle of an entire philosophical and spiritual system that would take 30 years to build and that would cost her everything to live. But in 1923, sitting in a Paris apartment, trying to decide whether her existence was justified, it was simply the thought that kept her alive. She went back to work. The education she received in the following years was the finest available to a young woman of her class and era in France. The system rewarded exactly the kind of rigorous, argumentative intelligence she possessed, and as she moved through her secondary education and toward the great competitive examinations that determined entry to the elite institutions, it became clear that whatever her private doubts, the system thought rather highly of her abilities. She prepared for the entrance examination to the École Normale Supérieure, the most prestigious institution of higher education in France, the school that had produced the intellectual elite of the Republic for generations, the examination was brutally competitive. A small number of places, a very large number of extremely well-prepared candidates. Simone was admitted. In the same examination year, Simone de Beauvoir, who would become one of the most important French philosophers and feminist thinkers of the 20th century, also sat for entry. De Beauvoir would later recall encountering Simone Weil during this period. The exchange she describes in her memoirs is brief but revealing. De Beauvoir told Simone that what interested her was learning to make sense of the world. Simone replied that what interested her was finding a way to put food in the stomachs of the people who were starving. De Beauvoir was not sure what to make of this. She concluded that the person she had just spoken to was either deeply admirable or deeply strange, or quite possibly both. She was not wrong. At the École Normale, Simone studied under the philosopher known as Alain, whose real name was Émile Auguste Chartier, a figure of considerable influence in French intellectual life, who taught a version of philosophical inquiry rooted in working through problems from first principles rather than building on accumulated conclusions. Alain's method suited Simone exactly. She was already doing this. What he provided was a framework and a vocabulary and, more importantly, a teacher who recognized what she was and responded to it seriously. She was, by the accounts of her fellow students, a remarkable presence in seminars. She did not perform brilliance the way some gifted students do, using intellectual display to establish social position. She argued because she was genuinely trying to understand something, and she followed an argument wherever it led with a single-mindedness that could be uncomfortable for the people in the room. If a position she had held turned out to be wrong, she abandoned it without defensiveness. If a position she disagreed with turned out to be right, she accepted it with the same lack of ceremony. These qualities, combined with her physical appearance, which was deliberately unadorned, her manner of dress, which was closer to working-class practical than bourgeois Parisian, and her habit of discussing labour politics with the same intensity she brought to Plato, made her a figure that people remembered, not always fondly. She was not an easy person to know. She was not trying to be. She graduated in 1931, certified to teach philosophy. She was 22 years old. Her first teaching post was at a girls' lycée in Le Puy, a provincial town in central France. The appointment was not distinguished, but Simone was not interested in distinction in that sense. What she was interested in, with increasing urgency, was the question of what philosophy actually owed to the people who were suffering most in the world she lived in. France, in the early 1930s, was feeling the full pressure of the global economic depression that had followed the American stock market collapse of 1929. Unemployment was rising. The labour movement was increasingly active and increasingly divided. The political tensions that would eventually tear European civilization apart were visible to anyone paying attention. In their early forms, Simone was paying attention. At Le Puy, she did something that shocked her colleagues and alarmed her employers. She began attending meetings of the local labour union, not as an observer gathering material for an academic paper, as a participante, as someone who believed that her presence in those rooms was the minimum required of a person who claimed to care about justice. She joined picket lines. She marched with unemployed workers. She brought some of her students to union meetings, a decision that generated a formal complaint to the Ministry of Education. The headmaster received inquiries from the ministry about the political activities of his philosophy teacher. He was not pleased. He was also not entirely sure what to do with her, because by every available measure of teaching quality, Simone was excellent, and her students consistently reported that her classes had changed the way they thought. She continued, she was developing, in these years, a critique of Marxist thought that would become one of her most distinctive intellectual contributions. She was not anti-Marxist in the conservative sense. She had too much first-hand knowledge of what the existing order did to working people to defend it. But she was developing serious doubts about whether the Marxist analysis of oppression was adequate to what she was actually observing. Marx located the source of oppression in the ownership of the means of production. Change ownership, and the oppression would dissolve. Simone was not convinced. What she was seeing in the labour meetings and on the picket lines was that the degradation of industrial work was not simply a function of who owned the factory. It was a function of what industrial production did to the person performing it. Regardless of ownership, the machine imposed its rhythm. The person became an extension of the machine. The dehumanization was built into the structure of the work itself. If you transferred ownership to the state, but kept the factories and the rhythms of production intact, what had actually changed for the person on the line? This was not a comfortable conclusion. It fit neatly into no available political category. She did not modify it to make it more comfortable. She was not in the habit of that. She was 24 years old, teaching philosophy in a provincial French town, marching with workers, arguing with Marxists, filling notebooks with observations and questions she shared with almost no one, and she had not yet been to the factory floor herself. That was about to change, and when it did, it would break her in ways she had not anticipated, and it would also give her something she had been looking for since she was 14 years old. Sitting in a Paris apartment, trying to decide whether her existence was worth the cost, she was about to find out what attention really meant when the thing you were attending to was your own suffering. Chapter 2. The Factory Floor Philosophy Meets Flesh. Paris, December of 1933. The Rue Le Courbe runs through the 15th arrondissement in the southwest of the city, a working district of warehouses and small manufactories and apartment buildings, whose residents work with their hands for wages that leave little margin for error. On a cold morning in December of 1933, a young woman in practical clothes and thick-lensed glasses walked through the gates of the Alstom electrical equipment factory on this street and asked for a job on the production line. She had a degree from the most prestigious institution in France. She was certified to teach philosophy. She had published essays read by people in the French intellectual left. None of this was relevant to the man reviewing her application. What was relevant was whether she could operate the machinery, show up on time, and meet the production quotas the factory required. She was hired. She did not tell them who she was. She had taken a leave of absence from her teaching post. She had arranged, with the help of friends who thought she was either admirable or reckless depending on their mood, to spend several months working in Parisian factories as an ordinary worker, not as a researcher, not as a journalist, not as someone gathering material she would later convert into an academic paper about the condition of the working class. As a worker, the distinction mattered enormously to her, and almost no one around her fully understood why. Her friends in the labour movement saw it as a gesture of solidarity, which it partly was, but also as somewhat theatrical, a bourgeois intellectual playing at being proletarian. Her mother Mime was alarmed and did not conceal it. Her father Bernard received the news with the quiet concern of a physician who understood what factory work did to bodies, and was watching his daughter choose it deliberately. Simone understood all of these reactions. She did not disagree with any of them entirely. She went anyway. The reasoning was not sentimental. She had been writing and speaking about the condition of working people for 3 years. She had attended their meetings, marched on their picket lines, argued on their behalf in publications and seminar rooms, and she had become, with increasing discomfort, aware of a gap that all of this activity could not close. She knew about the condition of workers the way a person knows about a country they have studied extensively but never visited. She had information. She did not have knowledge. For Simone, this distinction was not academic. She believed, with a conviction that would run through everything she wrote for the rest of her life, that understanding a form of suffering required some form of contact with it. The person who writes about hunger from a full stomach and the person who writes about hunger from memory are not writing the same thing. Even if every fact they cite is identical, she wanted to write from memory. She worked at the Alstom plant from December of 1933 through to the spring of 1934, a period of several months that her biographer Petrament describes as among the most physically and psychologically demanding of her life. After Alstom, she moved to a factory run by the Carnord company that manufactured metal components, and then to the Renault plant at Billancourt, the largest industrial facility in France and one of the most significant symbols of modern industrial production in Europe. The work at Alstom was on the electrical components line. She operated a drill press, performing the same motion hundreds of times each day, leaning into the machine, withdrawing, repositioning the component, leaning in again. The rhythm was not metaphorical. It was physical, mechanical, imposed by the production quota rather than by any human decision about pace or rest. You did not work at the speed that felt natural. You worked at the speed the quota required, which was always slightly faster than comfortable, and sometimes considerably faster than that. Her hands were not prepared for this. Her body was not prepared for this. She had always been physically fragile, in ways she refused to acknowledge or accommodate, prone to the severe headaches that had plagued her since childhood. Thin, in a way that suggested a body consuming more than it was receiving. The factory work hit this body with an immediacy that no amount of intellectual preparation could have softened. She kept a journal throughout this period. The factory journal, as it has come to be known, is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of political philosophy, not because of its theoretical sophistication, though it has that, but because of its granular honesty about what the experience was actually doing to her. She writes about the headaches with clinical precision. She writes about the specific quality of exhaustion that accumulates across a week of production line work, different from the exhaustion of intellectual labour or physical exercise, in a way she struggles to find adequate language for. She writes about the moments when she makes an error and the supervisor appears, not to understand what went wrong, but to note the error in the record that determines whether she keeps her job. She writes, in one entry that her biographers have returned to repeatedly, about a moment at the drill press when she is so tired and in so much pain from the headaches that she loses track of where she is for a period she cannot accurately estimate afterward. When she comes back to herself, the machine is still running. Her hands are still moving. The quota is still accumulating. The body had continued without her. "This," she writes, "is what the factory does. It does not require your presence. It requires your hands. The distinction between the person and the instrument becomes, over time, very difficult to maintain." But the most original observation in the factory journal is not about pain or exhaustion. It is about time. She noticed something that no amount of reading Marx or attending labour meetings had prepared her to see, because it was not visible from the outside. The factory did not simply consume your hours. It imposed a specific structure on time that made certain kinds of thought impossible. Not difficult, impossible. The kind of thought that builds across minutes, that returns to itself, that accumulates toward understanding. The kind of thought Simone had organized her entire life around was simply not compatible with the rhythm of production line work. The machine did not give you enough consecutive inner moments to sustain it. She sits with this observation in the journal, turns it over, tests it against what she is experiencing, and what she concludes is that the deprivation of the factory is not simply material, it is cognitive. The person on the production line is not only being paid too little and worked too hard, they are being systematically denied the conditions necessary for the kind of inner life she believes is the foundation of human dignity. And the specific cruelty of this deprivation is that it is self-reinforcing. The exhaustion produced by the work makes the recovery of inner life outside working hours nearly impossible as well. You come home too tired to think. You eat. You sleep. You return. The cycle does not leave room for the sustained attention she is beginning to understand as the most fundamental human capacity. She left Alstom in the spring of 1934, her health having deteriorated significantly during the months there. She found work at the Carnot plant, and then at Renault. At Renault, the most mechanized of the three environments she worked in, she observed something that shifted her political analysis in a direction she had not expected. She had gone into the factory experience expecting to find her existing analysis confirmed and made concrete. The workers, oppressed by capitalist ownership, the solution waiting in collective action and structural change. What she found was more complicated and in some ways more disheartening. She found workers who had, in many cases, internalized the logic of the factory so completely that resistance had become almost unthinkable. Not because they lacked dignity or intelligence, because the systematic erosion of inner life that the work imposed had, over years and decades, made certain kinds of imagining very difficult. The imagination of alternatives requires a kind of mental freedom that the factory was specifically organized to prevent. She also found supervisors who were themselves trapped in the logic of the system. Men who were harsh, not out of personal viciousness, but out of the pressure of quotas descending from above, that left them no room for humanity at the bottom. The structure produced cruelty independently of the characters of the people within it. This was the insight that would separate her political thinking from orthodox Marxism for the rest of her life. The problem was not simply that bad people owned the means of production. The problem was that certain structures produced oppression regardless of the intentions of the people within them. Change the owner and keep the structure, and you had changed very little of what actually mattered to the person on the line. The factory months ended in the summer of 1934. Simone returned to teaching, physically depleted in ways that would not fully resolve, carrying experiences that she spent the following years trying to work through in writing. The result was an essay she completed in 1934 and distributed privately to a small number of colleagues. titled Reflections Concerning the Causes of Liberty and Social Oppression. It is a work of remarkable originality, a systematic critique of both capitalism and Soviet communism that locates the source of oppression not in ownership alone, but in the structure of large-scale organization itself. Power, she argues, tends to reproduce and expand regardless of who holds it. The revolutionary who seizes power in the name of the oppressed does not thereby escape the logic of power. He enters it. Leon Trotsky, the exiled Bolshevik leader, read the essay and met with Simone to discuss it. According to accounts from people who knew of the meeting, it was not an easy conversation for either party. Trotsky was not accustomed to being argued with by 25-year-old women who had spent months on a factory floor. Simone was not accustomed to moderating her conclusions out of respect for someone's historical significance. They did not reach agreement. She was not looking for agreement. She was looking for the truth of the thing, wherever it led, and she was becoming increasingly convinced that it led somewhere that none of the available political frameworks had yet mapped. She returned to teaching. She continued writing. She continued attending labour meetings and arguing in print about the condition of working people and the inadequacy of the political tools available to change it. And then, in the summer of 1936, the Spanish Civil War began, and Simone Weil did what almost everyone who knew her feared she would do. She went. Chapter 3. Spain and the Absurdity of Violence. Barcelona, August of 1936. The city that received Simone in August of 1936 was a city in the grip of a specific kind of electricity, the energy of a social order that has been suddenly inverted and has not yet understood what the inversion is going to cost. The streets were full of workers in overalls carrying weapons they were still learning how to use, of political pamphlets and revolutionary songs, of the particular intoxication that arrives when a structure that has seemed permanent reveals that it is not. The anarchist trade unions controlled significant parts of the city. The old hierarchies of class and church and property had been, in the first weeks of the uprising against Franco, suspended or overturned or simply ignored. Simone arrived alone, having crossed the border from France without the knowledge of her parents and without any military training, any combat experience, or any plan beyond the conviction that if there was fighting happening against fascism, she needed to be in it. She was 27 years old. She wore thick-lensed glasses she was nearly blind without. She was physically fragile in ways the factory months had made worse rather than better. She could not shoot accurately. She did not speak Spanish with any fluency. What she had was the same thing she always had: the complete inability to remain at a comfortable distance from suffering. She believed she had an obligation to share. She made her way to the Aragon front, where anarchist militias were operating against Franco's nationalist forces, and joined one of the anarchist columns active in that region. The columns included volunteers from several countries, men and women who had come to Spain for the same reason Simone had. She was given a rifle. She practiced with it. She was, by her own account, in the essay she later wrote about the Spanish experience, a poor shot who showed no particular improvement. This did not especially concern her. The shooting was not why she had come. She had come because she believed that to oppose fascism in speeches and articles, while the people actually fighting it risked their lives, was a form of moral cowardice she was not willing to live with. The conditions on the Aragon front in the summer of 1936 were what the conditions of a poorly supplied militia in a civil war would be expected to be: inadequate food, inadequate water, inadequate medical supplies, the constant disorientation of not knowing at any given moment where the front line was or what was happening beyond the range of your immediate vision. Simone managed these conditions poorly in the physical sense. The headaches intensified in the heat. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. And then she stepped in a pot of boiling oil. A field kitchen had positioned a container of boiling oil in a spot that was not adequately marked. Simone, whose eyesight was poor and who was not watching the ground, stepped into it. The burn was severe, covering a significant portion of her leg and foot. She was evacuated to a hospital behind the lines, and then her parents, who had discovered where she was, arrived and brought her to recover in Sitges on the Catalan coast. She was furious about leaving, not about the burn, which she acknowledged with characteristic practicality, about being removed before she had done what she had come to do. She spent the weeks of recovery writing letters and beginning to process, in the way she processed everything, what she had actually seen and what it meant. And what she had seen was considerably more complicated than the story she had told herself before she went. She had arrived believing, with the confidence of someone whose political analysis was thorough and whose moral convictions were clear, that the Republican side was the right side, and that this made its violence distinguishable from the violence of the wrong side. What she witnessed did not support this distinction as cleanly as she had expected. She writes about this in the essay she later produced about the Spanish experience, with a precision she described as the result of forcing herself to look at things she would have preferred not to examine. She describes, in terms drawn from her own observation and kept deliberately within what she could directly report, the specific quality of what she calls the intoxication of violence, the way that force, once taken up for whatever reason, begins to generate its own justifications and its own momentum, independent of the cause it was originally taken up in the service of. She writes that she went to Spain expecting to find a clear distinction between the violence of the just and the violence of the unjust. What she found, as she describes it in the essay, was that the logic of force has its own grammar, and that grammar does not respect the intentions of the people who enter it. People of genuine idealism, she writes, people who had come for the same reasons she had, were capable, within the structure of war, of doing things that their idealism could not have predicted or endorsed. She writes with equal honesty about moments when she herself failed to act in ways she later believed she should have acted. She does not describe these moments in detail beyond what she can honestly report. She includes them because she understood that a critique of violence that exempts the critic is not an honest critique. What she was working toward, in the weeks at Sitges and in the years that followed, was the philosophical framework she would develop in one of her most celebrated essays, on the nature of force and what it does to everyone who touches it. But in the summer of 1936, it was not yet a framework. It was an experience she did not yet have adequate language for. Sitting in a recovery room on the Catalan coast while her leg healed, writing in her notebooks, trying to understand what she had seen. She left Spain in September of 1936. She returned to France, returned to teaching, kept writing with the urgency of someone who understands that the time available is not unlimited, though she did not yet know how specifically limited it would turn out to be. The political frameworks available to her, Marxism, anarchism, socialist democracy, were proving inadequate to the problem they were trying to solve, not because their goals were wrong, but because their analysis of human nature was incomplete. They could describe oppression. They could organize resistance. What they could not do was account for the tendency of resistance, at the moment of its success, to reproduce the very structures it had set out to dismantle. What was missing in the analysis was something she did not yet have language for. She was working toward it in the notebooks she filled during these years, following the argument wherever it led, and the argument was beginning to lead somewhere that went deeper than economics and deeper than politics. In a chapel in Assisi, the following spring, something would happen that she had not been looking for and could not have prepared for. She was not ready for it. It arrived anyway. Chapter 4. The Mystic Who Did Not Want to Be One. Assisi, Italy, spring of 1937. The town of Assisi sits on the slope of Monte Subasio in the Umbrian region of central Italy, a small medieval city of pale stone that has been drawing pilgrims for 8 centuries. Since the man born Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardone chose poverty and the repair of broken churches over the merchant career his father had planned for him, and in doing so became Francis, the saint whose name the city carries into the present. Simone arrived in the spring of 1937, not as a pilgrim, and not as a believer. She came the way a person of serious intellectual formation comes to a place of historical and cultural significance, with attention and without expectation, prepared to observe and understand, but not to be changed. She had been travelling in Italy on a journey that was part recuperation and part the restless intellectual movement of someone who cannot stay still when there are things to understand. The headaches were severe. Her health, which the factory year and the Spanish months had eroded, had not fully recovered. Her mother Mime had encouraged the Italian journey, partly because she understood that Simone would not take a rest cure unless it was attached to something she considered more important than rest. Italy was full of things Simone considered more important than rest. She moved through the country with the methodical attentiveness she brought to everything, visiting churches and ancient sites and museums, writing in the notebooks she carried everywhere, reading in the evenings, paying the specific kind of attention to what was actually in front of her rather than to her own response to it. In Assisi, she visited the Porziuncola, the small chapel inside the Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli that is most directly associated with Francis himself, the place where he received his vocation and where, according to the tradition, he died. It is a small structure, plain by the standards of the ornate basilica built around it centuries later, and the plainness is part of what it is. It was built by Francis's own hands. Simone entered the chapel. She described what happened next, years later, in a letter to her spiritual director, Father Joseph Marie Perrin, a Dominican priest she would meet after returning to France, and who would become the recipient of some of the most important letters she ever wrote. She is careful in this letter, as she was careful in everything she wrote, to describe the experience precisely and within the boundaries of what she can honestly report. In her own account, something in the beauty and the historical weight of the place compelled her, against her own intention, to kneel. She had not knelt in prayer before. She was alone, or nearly so, and the kneeling was as she describes it. Not planned. Something in her went down before something else, and she could not, afterward, characterize what had happened in purely aesthetic terms. It was not simply that she had been moved by beauty. She had been moved by beauty before without kneeling. She does not claim, in the letter to Perrin, to have experienced what she would call a conventional religious event. She was too careful with language to reach for a term that carried so much conventional freight. But she writes, in her own account, of something she describes as the first time she felt the presence of something that was not produced by her own mind. She left Assisi and continued her Italian journey. She did not rush to convert. She did not seek out a priest or begin attending Mass. She filed the experience in the part of her mind reserved for things that required prolonged attention before they could be adequately understood. And she returned to France and to teaching and to the writing and the arguments. Something had shifted. She did not yet have language for what it was. The second experience, she describes, came the following year, at the Abbey of Solesmes in northwestern France, during Holy Week of 1938. Solesmes is a Benedictine monastery renowned throughout the Catholic world for the quality of its Gregorian chant. The monks had spent decades restoring ancient chant traditions to their historical authenticity, and the liturgical singing during Holy Week was understood even by people with no religious commitment as one of the most extraordinary musical experiences available in France. Simone attended the Holy Week services at Solesmes in a condition of significant physical distress. The headaches that had plagued her since childhood were, in that period, so severe that she described them to Father Perrin as a pain occupying her entire skull continuously, the kind of pain that makes sustained attention to anything outside itself nearly impossible. She attended the services anyway. She describes what followed in the same letter to Father Perrin, and she is careful here, as she was careful throughout this correspondence, to frame what she is reporting as her own experience and her own understanding of it, rather than as a claim about the objective structure of reality. In her account, something happened in the middle of the chanting, in the midst of the pain, that she struggled for the rest of her life to describe with the precision she brought to everything else. The beauty of the chanting and the intensity of the physical suffering occupied the same space simultaneously, and in that double presence something opened that she had not known was there. She was not transported out of her suffering. She was present to it and present to the music at the same time, and the two together created a condition that was different in kind from anything she had experienced before. She writes, in her account to Perrin, that she came to feel herself in contact with something she eventually, after considerable resistance, began to name as the presence of Christ. She is explicit that she is describing her own experience as she understood it. Not making a theological argument, she expects her reader to simply accept. During her time at Solesmes, she also encountered a poem by the 17th century English poet George Herbert called Love, a dialogue between the soul and love itself, in which love invites the soul to enter and eat, and the soul keeps finding reasons why it is not worthy, and love keeps answering the objections gently, and at the end the soul simply sits down and eats. Simone memorized the poem and recited it to herself during subsequent attacks of the headaches, using it in the way, as she later wrote to Perrin, of someone using a text as a form of prayer. Though she was still not fully comfortable with the word prayer, she writes that during one of these recitations, she experienced what she describes, in her own account, as an encounter she had not sought and could not have produced by an act of will, she reports this as something she believes happened to her, while being careful not to present it as a claim she expects her reader to accept without question. She was in her late 20s. She had not been looking for this. And the woman who had built her intellectual life on rigorous argument and the refusal to accept anything that could not withstand scrutiny was now, privately and with considerable discomfort, carrying an experience that did not fit any of the categories her secular and political formation had prepared her for. The question she now faced was what to do with it. The obvious answer, the one that Father Perrin, when she finally met him, would gently and persistently encourage, was baptism, entry into the Catholic Church, the formal reception of the sacraments. Simone refused. She refused with the same care and precision she brought to everything, articulating her reasons in a series of letters and essays that are among the most theologically sophisticated documents produced by a non-theologian in the 20th century. Her refusal was not ambivalent. She was making a deliberate and considered choice, and the reasons behind it illuminate something central to who she was. Her first reason was intellectual. She was not satisfied that the Catholic Church had a monopoly on the spiritual truth it claimed. She had read widely in the religious traditions of the world, in the Upanishads, in the Bhagavad Gita, in ancient Greek religious thought, and she had found in these traditions what seemed to her genuine encounters with the same reality she had experienced in Assisi and Solesmes. A church that required her to regard these traditions as inferior or false was asking her to accept something her honest reading of the evidence would not support. Her second reason was historical. The Catholic Church had, throughout its history, used its institutional power in ways she found morally indefensible. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the consistent alignment of the institutional church with the powerful against the powerless. She was not willing to join an institution whose historical record she could not endorse, even if she believed its theology contained essential truth. Her third reason was the one most distinctly her own. She had always been drawn toward the people who were outside, the workers excluded from political power, the unemployed excluded from economic participation, the colonial subjects excluded from the civilization that claimed to be civilizing them. The church was for the baptized. For the included, she wanted to remain with the excluded. She writes, in one of her most carefully considered formulations, that she believes she has been given a vocation to remain at the threshold, to be present at the place where Christianity and everything outside Christianity meet. She does not present this as comfortable. She does not claim she would not have preferred to simply enter and belong. She presents it as the vocation she understands herself to have been given, and she has never been willing to refuse a vocation because it was inconvenient. Father Perrin read these letters with a combination of profound admiration and genuine theological concern. He could not argue her out of her positions because the positions were too carefully constructed and too honestly held to be argued away. He continued to hope she would eventually enter the church. She never did. She was 30 years old and she had been changed, without asking to be changed, by a chapel in Assisi and a monastery in Solesmes and a 17th century English poem. The philosophical framework she was building, the one that would become her most original contribution, was still being constructed. The language for it was almost ready. She called one part of it gravity. She called the other part grace. Chapter 5. Gravity and Grace. The Architecture of Her Philosophy. The Ardèche region of France. Summer of 1941. The farmhouse where Gustave Thibon lived and worked sat in the Ardèche, a region of southern France where the landscape is rocky and dry in summer and the vineyards run along the slopes in the specific ordered way of places that have been cultivated for a very long time. The work was physical and seasonal, and it began early in the morning and ended when the light was gone. Simone had been here for several weeks now, working in the rows of vines alongside the farm labourers, her hands moving through the leaves with the methodical care she brought to every physical task she had ever undertaken. She was thin and not entirely well, and she was working harder than her body had resources for, which was not a new situation for her. In the evenings, she sat with Thibon at the farmhouse table, and they talked. Thibon was a Catholic philosopher of conservative disposition who had agreed, at the request of a mutual friend, to offer Simone work on the farm, and who had expected to find the encounter uncomfortable and had instead found himself unable to stop thinking about the conversations they were having. He was not accustomed to minds that moved the way hers did, following an argument wherever it went, without pausing to check whether the destination was convenient. She was explaining to him, in the evenings, a framework she had been building for years, a way of understanding the forces that operate on human beings in the world as it is. He gave her the New Testament in Greek. She taught herself the language specifically in order to read it in the original. In the same way, she had always approached things she needed to understand properly, by going back to the source. The framework she was explaining to Thibon, and working through in the notebooks she kept beside her bed, would eventually be published after her death under the title Gravity and Grace, a collection assembled by Thibon himself from the notebooks she left in his care when she departed for Marseille. It is one of the most compressed and demanding works in 20th century philosophy, a book that readers return to across decades, finding new things each time. To understand what she was building, you have to start not with God, but with physics. Not literal physics. She was not a scientist and did not claim to be one. But she thought in physical metaphors with the precision of someone who understood that a good metaphor is not decoration but argument, a way of showing the structure of a thing rather than merely describing it. The fundamental observation is this: in the physical world, everything falls, not as a metaphor. As a fact, objects move toward the lowest available point unless something intervenes. Gravity is not malicious. It has no purpose. It is simply the condition of material existence, the direction in which things go when nothing else is acting on them. Human beings, she argues, are subject to an equivalent force in the moral and psychological realm. The natural direction of human behaviour, in the absence of something intervening, is downward, toward the self, toward domination, toward the reproduction of the very patterns of oppression she had been analysing since the factory year, not because human beings are evil, because the forces operating on us in the world as it is, the desire for security, the fear of humiliation, the need to protect what we have, all pull in the same direction. She calls this force pesanteur, gravity, or, in some translations, heaviness. It is the moral equivalent of physical gravity, operating on all of us all the time, producing, when nothing resists it, the behaviour that most of recorded history is made of. Thibon listens to her across the farmhouse table in the evenings. He pushes back. She answers. She is not performing a lecture. She is thinking out loud in the specific way of someone for whom conversation is one of the primary tools of intellectual work, testing the framework against a mind that will not simply accept it. The counterforce, she tells him, she calls grace. Grace, in her framework, is not primarily a theological term, though it becomes that as well. It is the name for whatever operates against gravity. Whatever causes a human being to move upward, toward generosity rather than acquisition, toward seeing another person as a full subject rather than an instrument, toward the good rather than the self-serving. Grace is not earned. It cannot be produced by an act of will. The will, in her analysis, is itself subject to gravity. You cannot will yourself into grace any more than you can will a stone to fall upward. What you can do, and this is where her philosophy becomes both most original and most demanding, is get out of the way. She calls this decreation. Decreation is one of the most difficult ideas in her work and has been misread frequently, often in ways that lead people to conclude she was advocating passive self-erasure, a mystical quietism indifferent to the world and its suffering. This misreading is almost exactly backwards. Decreation does not mean self-destruction. It does not mean the elimination of the self. It means the suspension of the self's habitual tendency to occupy the centre of the picture, to interpret everything in terms of its own needs and fears and desires, to turn every encounter with another person or with reality into a transaction organized around its own interests. She pauses in her explanation and looks out the farmhouse window at the dark outside. The vines are invisible now, but she knows where they are. She has been moving through them all day. The created self, she continues, is precisely the self that gravity has shaped. The self formed by the world as it is, by the pressures and rewards and punishments that have operated on us since childhood. This self is not evil. It is limited. It sees through the lens of its own position. It cannot see clearly. Decreation is the practice of loosening this self's grip, interrupting its automatic operation long enough for something else to become visible, for the reality of another person to actually register, rather than being processed through the filter of the self's own concerns. She knows how difficult this sounds. She knows how much more difficult it actually is. She is not describing a spiritual technique that produces pleasant results if you practice it consistently. She is describing the hardest thing a human being can do, the thing that runs most directly against the grain of everything that gravity operates to produce. The practice she proposes runs through what she calls attention. She uses this word with very specific meaning. She does not mean concentration in the ordinary sense. The focused deployment of intellectual effort toward a chosen object. This kind of effort, she argues, is still organized around the self, still a form of the will's imposition on reality rather than reality's reception. The attention, she means, is almost the opposite of effort. It is a quality of receptive, waiting openness, a suspension of the self's interpretive machinery that allows the thing being attended to, whether a mathematical problem, a person in pain, or the presence of God, to show itself as it actually is rather than as the self's needs have shaped it to appear. She develops this with an example that has stayed with readers for decades. She describes a student struggling with a geometry problem. The student who responds with increased effort, who forces and strains and pushes the problem toward a solution, is not practicing the attention she means. The student who sits with the problem, holding it openly, remaining present to it without demanding that it yield, is practicing something that goes beyond the particular geometry lesson. the practice of remaining present to something difficult without forcing it, without fleeing it, trains the soul in a way that nothing else does. The most important application of this attention is not geometry. It is the person in front of you who is suffering. Genuine attention to someone in pain does not mean offering solutions or projecting your own understanding of suffering onto theirs. It means asking, simply and genuinely, what are you going through? And then remaining, without flinching and without converting what you hear into something more comfortable than it actually is, with the answer, this sounds simple. She knows it sounds simple. The entire architecture of her philosophy is an attempt to explain why it is the hardest thing in the world, and why almost everything in our nature and our social organization is working against it. Thibon sets down his glass and looks at her across the table. He is beginning to understand what he is in the presence of, not a system, not a doctrine, something more like a diagnosis of the human condition that has been arrived at through direct experience of the factory floor and the front lines of a civil war and a chapel in Assisi where a secular philosopher knelt, without knowing why. The framework she is describing to him in these evenings, in the farmhouse in the Ardèche, is not finished. She is still working. The notebooks she keeps beside her bed are filling up. The language is becoming more precise. The connections between the political and the mystical and the philosophical are becoming clearer. She will bring this framework to Marseille, where she will develop it into its fullest form. The concept of malheur, the affliction that does not simply hurt but destroys, the suffering that convinces the person experiencing it that the suffering is deserved. But that is Marseille, and that is the next chapter. Tonight she is in the Ardèche, at a farmhouse table, talking with a man who was sceptical of her and is becoming astonished by her, while outside the window the vines run along the dark slopes in the specific ordered way of things that have been tended for a very long time. She picks up her pen. There is more to work through before morning. Thibon sets down his glass and looks at her across the table. He is beginning to understand what he is in the presence of. Not a system, not a doctrine, something more like a diagnosis of the human condition that has been arrived at through direct experience of the factory floor and the front lines of a civil war and a chapel in Assisi where a secular philosopher knelt without knowing why. The framework she is describing to him in these evenings, in the farmhouse in the Ardèche, is not finished. She is still working. The notebooks she keeps beside her bed are filling up. The language is becoming more precise. The connections between the political and the mystical and the philosophical are becoming clearer. She will bring this framework to Marseille, where she will develop it into its fullest form. The concept of malheur, the affliction that does not simply hurt but destroys, the suffering that convinces the person experiencing it that the suffering is deserved. But that is Marseille, and that is the next chapter. Tonight she is in the Ardèche, at a farmhouse table, talking with a man who was sceptical of her and is becoming astonished by her, while outside the window the vines run along the dark slopes in the specific ordered way of things that have been tended for a very long time. She picks up her pen. There is more to work through before morning. Chapter 6. Affliction, the difference between suffering and destruction. Marseille, 1940 to 1942. The city of Marseille, in the years after the fall of Paris, has a specific quality in the historical memory of the period. A city full of people in transit, people waiting, people who had fled something and were not yet sure where they were going or whether they would be allowed to go there. The cafes along the Canebière were full of people who looked like they were simply having coffee and were actually waiting for documents, for contacts, for the particular combination of paperwork and luck that might get them out. Simone and her parents had left Paris before the Germans arrived, following the enormous exodus of French civilians who understood that the city under occupation was not a place where a Jewish family, however secular, could assume safety. They settled in Marseille, in the unoccupied zone administered directly by Vichy rather than under German military control. It was not safety. It was a different form of danger at a somewhat greater distance. Simone spent 2 years in Marseille, and they were, in the specific sense that applies to intellectual work, among the most productive years of her life. She wrote with an intensity that people around her found alarming, filling notebooks with the philosophy she had been building since the factory year, writing essays she distributed through whatever channels were available, meeting with the small community of thinkers and resistors who had gathered in the unoccupied South. It was during these months that she met Father Perrin, the Dominican priest who became her spiritual director and to whom she wrote the letters that would eventually be published under the title Waiting for God. She was also working in the fields at Thibon's farm, and in the evenings at the farmhouse table developing the framework described in the previous chapter. She taught herself Greek from the New Testament Thibon gave her. She read with the same methodical intensity she had always brought to things she needed to understand properly, going back to the source. It was in these Marseille years that she developed the concept that many scholars consider the most important in her entire body of work. She called it malheur. The French word translates approximately as misfortune or unhappiness, but she uses it in a way that breaks entirely free of those ordinary meanings. She was aware that she was using a common word to name something that common language had not adequately named, something that required its own precision if it was going to be understood rather than merely gestured at. Malheur is not suffering. Suffering, in her analysis, is a broad category that includes all forms of pain, difficulty, grief, and distress. Suffering is part of human life. It is not pleasant, but it is not. In itself, the thing she is trying to name, malheur, is the specific form of suffering that destroys not necessarily the body, the soul. She is very precise about what malheur requires. It needs, she argues, 3 elements operating simultaneously: physical pain of significant intensity or duration, social degradation, the specific experience of being treated by the surrounding world as though you do not fully matter, as though your pain does not register as the pain of a complete human being, and the threat of destruction, not necessarily immediate, but present as a permanent horizon that cannot be looked away from. When these 3 elements combine and sustain themselves over time, something happens that goes beyond ordinary suffering. The self, which under normal conditions maintains its sense of its own worth and its own reality, begins to lose that sense, not in a temporary way that recovery can address, in a structural way that changes what the person is capable of believing about themselves and about the world. She writes about this with a specificity that makes clear she is drawing on experience as well as observation. The factory year had given her a version of it, an incomplete version, because she had the resources to leave. The education and the social position that meant the factory's logic was never the total horizon of her existence, but she had felt the edges of it. She had experienced, in the months at Renault, the beginning of what it feels like to have your inner life systematically denied by the structure you are operating within, to be a person whose reality does not fully register to the people who have power over your days. What she describes in the person marked by malheur in its complete form is something that her readers have found powerfully resonant across the decades since her death. Not because the concept is comforting, but because it names something precisely that other frameworks approach only approximately. The person who has experienced malheur at its deepest does not simply feel pain, they feel, at the level of the self's basic orientation toward reality, that they do not deserve not to feel pain, that the suffering is appropriate, that it is not an injustice inflicted on someone who matters, but simply the natural condition of someone who does not. This is the specific cruelty of malheur. It does not only hurt the person, over time, in its complete form, it persuades the person that the hurt is right. She makes a connection here, in a move that is entirely her own, between this experience and what she describes as the experience of the absence of God. She writes, in her account, that the person in the grip of complete malheur feels not simply abandoned by other human beings, but abandoned by whatever it is that makes existence feel held and meaningful. They feel as though the force that sustains them in existence has looked away. And then she makes the move that separates her analysis from anything that could be called ordinary theodicy. She does not explain it away. She proposes, and she offers this as her own understanding rather than as a claim she expects her reader to simply accept, that the experience of God's absence in the midst of malheur is not necessarily a sign that God is not there. It is, in her own framework, the form that a certain kind of presence takes in the experience of complete affliction. She is not saying this to comfort. She is saying it as the most honest thing she can report about the structure of what she has observed and, in her own account, experienced. Outside the window of the apartment in Marseille, the city is moving through another evening. The people in the cafes along the Canebière are still waiting for their documents. The refugees are still waiting to leave. The Jewish families living under Vichy's legislation are trying to calculate how much time they have. She extends the analysis to the political dimension with the directness that has always characterized her thinking. The people most vulnerable to malheur in its complete form are the people at the bottom of every social distribution. The colonial subjects, the enslaved, the factory workers whose inner lives the production system is designed to prevent, the stateless and the refugees and the people whom the administrative machinery of the modern state has classified as not fully belonging to the category of people whose pain counts. These are the people who experience not just physical suffering, but the social dimension of it, the systematic treatment by the surrounding world as people whose reality does not fully register, and the political task, for someone who has understood malheur, is not simply to alleviate suffering in the material sense. It is to restore to the person marked by malheur the sense of their own reality, their own full weight as a human being, their own claim on the attention of the world. This is why attention, in her framework, is not only a spiritual practice, it is a political act. The person who genuinely attends to the malheur of another is doing something that no policy or structural reform, however well designed, can substitute for. They are saying, with the quality of their presence, that the other person's suffering is real and deserves to be looked at without flinching. She was living under increasing legal danger herself. Vichy had passed laws restricting the rights of Jewish citizens, and though she did not identify as Jewish in a religious or cultural sense, she was classified as Jewish under Vichy law. She was barred from teaching. She did not hide. She continued to write and to meet with people and to argue in the small publications circulating through resistance networks. She applied for permission to teach, knowing the application would be refused, and included in her application a letter explaining precisely why the racial laws were unjust. The letter was accurate, and it was useless, and she knew it was useless, and she wrote it anyway. In 1942, the situation in the unoccupied zone was deteriorating with a speed that made the direction of things unmistakable. The German occupation was expanding. The Vichy regime was implementing the deportation of Jews with an efficiency that removed any remaining ambiguity about where things were heading. Her parents had obtained visas for the United States. They urged her to come. She refused. She would not leave France for the safety of America while France was occupied and while there was any possibility of doing useful work for the resistance. What she eventually agreed to was going to London, where de Gaulle's Free French forces were operating, and working for the resistance from there. It was not the safety of New York. It was a different theatre of the same struggle. She left France in the spring of 1942. She and her parents crossed to North Africa, and from there, after a period of waiting, made their way to England. She would never see France again. She arrived in London in late 1942, carrying her notebooks and her manuscripts and the philosophy she had built in the years since the factory floor and Spain and Assisi. She was 33 years old. She was in poor health. She had a great deal of work she believed she still needed to do. She did not know how little time remained. But the concept she had built in those Marseille years, the precise and difficult and strangely hopeful understanding of Malheur, would be the lens through which everything that followed would need to be read, because what was coming was not the end of her encounter with affliction. It was its completion. Chapter 7. Waiting for God Attention as Spiritual Practice. London, winter of 1942 to 1943. The room Simone occupied in a boarding house near Carlton Gardens was small and cold in the specific way of London rooms in wartime. When coal was rationed and the landlords heated the common areas and left the individual rooms to manage with whatever warmth came up through the floors, the window looked out onto a street that had been partially rebuilt after the Blitz and partially left as it was, the gap-toothed skyline of a city that had absorbed a great deal and kept moving. She did not spend much time looking at the window. She was at her desk by 5 in the morning most days, before the city outside had fully committed to being awake, in the specific silence of the early hours that she had always preferred for the kind of thinking she did best. The notebooks were open. The candle, when the electricity was unreliable, was lit. The work was continuing. Outside, London was living in the particular suspended time of a city that has been through the worst of the bombing and is now waiting for the next thing, which everyone understands will be the invasion of Europe, which everyone understands is necessary, and which no one is entirely sure they are ready for. The streets in the morning had the quality of a stage being prepared for something that has not yet arrived. Simone moved through these streets on her way to the Free French offices at Carlton Gardens, the building that served as the administrative centre of de Gaulle's government in exile, where she had been assigned to work as a writer and analyst. She was good at this in the technical sense and deeply frustrated in the practical sense, because what the organisation needed was competent administrative writing, and what she wanted to produce was considerably more ambitious. She had arrived in London with a proposal. She wanted to lead a team of nurses to the front lines of the fighting in France. The idea was not, as it might sound in summary, simply impractical. It had a philosophical foundation entirely coherent with everything she had been building since the factory year. The people experiencing the most concentrated suffering in the war were the soldiers at the front lines. The people most in need of the kind of genuine attention she had been developing a philosophy around for years. The people positioned to provide that attention without themselves being combatants were nurses, not nurses at base hospitals, organized and removed from the immediate reality of the fighting, nurses at the front line, present in the place where the suffering was actually happening, before it had been processed and documented and converted into the institutional language of casualty reports. She wrote up the proposal in careful detail and submitted it. According to various accounts from people connected to the organization at the time, the response from de Gaulle's office was not warm. The accounts vary in their specifics, but the outcome is clear in the record. The proposal was rejected. It was rejected again when she submitted a revised version. She continued arguing for some form of the idea through the months she was in London, with the specific persistence of someone who has concluded that a thing is right and is not prepared to abandon it, simply because the people with authority to act on it have said no. In the meantime, she wrote, in the evenings and the early mornings, in whatever hours the official work did not consume, she sat at the desk in the cold room and filled notebooks with the philosophy and theology she had been building since the Marseille years. The essays and letters from this period would eventually be collected and published in several volumes. Most importantly, in the one that carries the title she had used to describe her own spiritual practice, Attente de Dieu, waiting for God. The French is more precise than the English translation in a way that matters. Attente means waiting, but a specific kind of waiting. Not the passive waiting of someone who has given up on action and is simply marking time. Not the anxious waiting of someone who cannot bear the uncertainty of the interval. The waiting of someone who is entirely and actively present, who has made themselves completely available, who is not organizing the future around their own preferences, who is simply, completely, there. This is the practice she is describing, and it is, she argues, the most important practice available to a human being, the most difficult, and the one that the entire structure of modern life is organized to prevent. She had been developing the concept of attention since an essay on school studies she had written in the 1930s, in which she first articulated the idea that the practice of attending to a difficult problem, even one you cannot solve, trains the soul in a way that nothing else does. In the London writings, she develops this into its fullest statement. The attention she describes is not effort. She returns to this repeatedly in different formulations because she understands it is the most counterintuitive aspect of her teaching and the most important to get right. The will cannot produce attention. The will can produce the outward form of it, the focused gaze and the effortful engagement, but the real thing, the complete receptive openness to the reality of what is before you, is not produced by the will. It is produced by the suspension of the will. She uses an image that has stayed with readers for decades. She describes a person searching for something they have lost. The person who searches by straining and forcing, turning over everything in the room with increasing desperation, often fails to find the thing even when it is present. because the quality of their attention is distorted by the urgency of their need. The person who stills themselves and looks quietly and without demand, allowing their gaze to rest on each part of the room without organizing the search around the pressure to find, often sees the thing immediately. This is not a metaphor for how to find lost objects. It is a description of the quality of mind that makes genuine encounter with reality possible. She sets down her pen for a moment and looks at the window. The street below is just beginning to show movement. The early workers and the milk deliveries and the specific quality of a London morning in wartime that she has become familiar with over the months she has been here. Then she picks up the pen again. She applies the concept of attention to prayer. She applies it to the study of mathematics and literature. She applies it to the experience of being present to another person's suffering. In each case, the structure is the same. The suspension of the self's agenda, the complete availability to what is actually there, rather than to what the self needs there to be. The connection to decreation is direct, and she makes it explicit. Each moment of genuine attention is a small act of self-removal, a brief interruption of the self's automatic tendency to organize everything around its own center. These moments, accumulated over a life of practice, are the practical content of what decreation actually means lived from the inside. She is careful to distinguish this from what she calls false attention, the kind that looks like the real thing from the outside but is organized, at its foundation, around the self's need to feel attentive rather than around the reality of what is being attended to. She has seen a great deal of false attention in her life. The people who perform sympathy for the suffering of others in ways that are really about the performance rather than the suffering. The religious practitioners whose prayer is organized around their own need for reassurance rather than around the reality of God. The political activists whose concern for justice is organized, more than they know, around their own need to be on the right side. She does not exempt herself from this critique. Some of the most honest passages in her London writings are the ones where she turns the analysis on herself, where she asks whether her own commitment to attention and decreation is genuine, or whether it is another form of the self's elaborate project of self-justification. She does not resolve this question. She holds it. The holding of it is itself, she would say, a form of the practice. The letters she wrote to Father Perrin from Marseille, which form the core of the Waiting for God volume, had been written when she believed she might see him again. When France felt potentially retrievable, the London writings carry a different quality. There is in them the specific compression of someone who is writing as though the available time is limited and the essential things need to be said now rather than later. She also wrote, "In these London months, the long manuscript that would eventually be published under the title The Need for Roots. It had a specific origin. She had been asked by the Free French organization to produce a report on the spiritual and cultural conditions that France would need to rebuild after liberation. It was a practical commission. What she produced went considerably beyond any brief she had been given. The manuscript is a sustained analysis of what she calls uprootedness, the condition of a civilization that has lost its connections to the particular, embodied, local forms of meaning that sustain human beings in their actual lives. She argues that the catastrophes of the 20th century, the wars, the totalitarianisms, the mass movements that swept millions into patterns of violence and submission, were not primarily the product of bad ideas or bad leaders. They were the product of populations that had been uprooted, that had lost, through industrialization and the specific erasures of colonial violence, the local connections to place and community and practice that give human life its texture and its sense of belonging. The uprooted person, in her analysis, is the person most vulnerable to the appeal of totalitarianism, because totalitarianism offers, among other things, a form of belonging, a cause, a story about who you are and where you fit and why your existence matters. When the legitimate forms of belonging have been destroyed, the illegitimate forms become irresistible. She is writing this in a cold room in London, in a city full of people who have been displaced by the same war she is trying to understand. And the specific reality of uprootedness is visible from her window every time she looks up from the notebook. De Gaulle received the manuscript and, by various accounts, did not know what to make of it. It was not the practical policy document he had requested. It was a philosophical and spiritual diagnosis of European civilization that ranged from Greek thought to the conditions of French factory workers to the theology of attention. He was a practical man of considerable intelligence who had asked for a report on French Reconstruction and received something that required several careful readings to begin to understand. He did not implement its recommendations. He also, apparently, could not dismiss it. Albert Camus, who read the manuscript after the war, recognized it immediately. He arranged for its publication at Gallimard in Paris. It was published in 1949, 6 years after Simone's death. But in the winter of 1942 to 1943, it was simply a manuscript being written in a cold room in London. In the hours between official work and the sleep that her body was increasingly demanding and not getting, something else was happening in that room that the people around her were becoming more concerned about with each passing week. She was not eating enough, not dramatically, not as a gesture anyone could easily point to, in the specific way of someone who had been treating the body as an instrument in the service of her commitments for so long that its particular requirements had become genuinely difficult to prioritize against the requirements of everything else she believed she needed to do. The colleagues who shared the building, the landlady at the boarding house, all of them were noticing, all of them were saying something. Simone was listening with the complete attention she brought to everything, and then she was continuing. She was waiting for what would be asked of her. She had a growing sense, which the letters and notebooks of this period make visible without ever stating it directly, that what would be asked was going to be more than she had already given. She was right. Chapter 8. The Politics of the Soul, Her Critique of Power, Paris. Spring of 1940. There is a moment in the spring of 1940, while the German army is moving through France, and the world Simone had grown up in is dissolving around her, when she sits down in a small room and begins to write an essay about a poem that was composed approximately 3,000 years ago. The poem is the Iliad. Outside the window, the specific catastrophe she is about to write about is happening in real time. Columns of refugees are moving south on the roads. The radio is delivering news that no one fully knows how to receive. And she is writing about Homer. The essay she produces will be published in a small resistance journal in 1941 under the title The Iliad, or The Poem of Force. It will become one of the most celebrated pieces of literary criticism produced in the 20th century. But it is not, at its foundation, a work of literary criticism. It is a work of political philosophy using a poem as its evidence, and the argument it makes is the central argument of everything she had been building since the factory floor. now stated with a directness that the approaching catastrophe had made possible, the true subject of the Iliad, she writes, is not heroism or glory or the fate of Troy. The true subject is force, and force, in her reading, is the thing that turns human beings into objects. She is precise about what she means. The person struck down by force becomes a thing in the most literal sense. A corpse, something that was a person and is now matter. This is the final expression of what force does, but she is more interested in what happens before the final expression, in the process by which force operates on the living. The person who lives under the constant threat of force is also transformed into something less than a full human being, not because they lack dignity, but because the permanent pressure of force distorts their capacity to think and feel and choose freely. They become organized around survival rather than around living. The full range of their humanity contracts, and then she makes the move that is most distinctly her own. The wielder of force, she argues, undergoes the same transformation. The person who has the power to turn others into objects is themselves being turned into an object of a different kind, a thing defined entirely by its capacity for destruction, a person who can no longer perceive the full humanity of the people they have power over, because perceiving that humanity would make the exercise of force impossible to continue. She reads the Iliad, in her analysis, as the most honest document in Western literature about what war actually is, because Homer takes no sides. The Trojans and the Greeks are shown with equal depth and equal clarity. Both are shown doing what force does to people. Both sides are being changed by the logic of violence they have entered. There are, in her reading, no heroes in the sense of people who have found a way to use force without being changed by it. There are only people who are, for the moment, on the winning side of a process that will eventually consume everyone. She was writing this while watching it happen outside her window. The implications for her political philosophy are direct, and she does not soften them. If force transforms everyone it touches, if the person who seizes power in the name of justice enters a relationship with power that gradually erodes their capacity to see the governed as fully human, then the problem of oppression cannot be solved simply by changing who holds power. The revolutionary who defeats the oppressor and takes the throne does not thereby escape the logic of force. They enter it from a different position. She had been working toward this conclusion since the factory year. The 1934 essay on oppression had stated it theoretically. Spain had confirmed it in the most concrete terms available. She had watched people who had come to Spain with genuine commitment to justice, doing things that the logic of violence required, and that the logic of justice could not fully endorse. The two logics were not reconcilable by purity of intention alone. Her critique of Marxism runs along these lines, and it is worth being precise about it because it has been misread in both directions across the decades since her death. She has been claimed by conservatives who read her critique of revolutionary politics as a defense of the existing order. She has been dismissed by the left as someone whose mysticism led her to abandon the political struggle. Both readings miss what she is actually doing. She is not arguing that the existing order is acceptable. She has too much first-hand knowledge of what that existing order does to working people to defend it. She is arguing that the available tools for changing it are inadequate to the depth of the problem. The problem, in her analysis, is not simply that the wrong people have power. The problem is that the structure of power itself, the organization of large-scale human societies around hierarchies of force and authority produces oppression independently of the intentions of the people within it. You can replace every individual in a hierarchy of power with someone of perfect intentions, and the structure will still produce oppression, because the structure is organized around the logic of force, and the logic of force does what it does regardless of the intentions of its current operators. She develops this into a concept she calls the Great Beast, a term she takes from the Book of Revelation and applies, in her reading, to the collective force of social organization when it has become entirely self-serving, when the state or the nation or the collective has absorbed all values into itself and made itself the final measure of everything. The Great Beast does not require individual villains. It requires only individuals who have surrendered their own judgment to the collective, who have accepted that the needs of the group supersede any individual claim on conscience. She sees the same dynamic in her analysis in the nationalisms of the 1930s, in both the fascist and the democratic variants. The nation that becomes the final value, that claims the right to define what is good by reference to its own interests and survival, has, in her reading, become a great beast regardless of what it calls itself, and the tools required to resist this tendency are not primarily political tools. They are the tools of attention and decreation, the capacity to maintain a judgment that is not derived from and not answerable to the collective. This is part of why she would not join the Catholic Church. The Church, as an institution, had too often become its own version of what she was describing, subordinating the claims of individual conscience to the institutional interests of an organization that had accumulated considerable power. She loved what the Church preserved and transmitted. She did not trust what the Church had become when its survival was at stake. She sets down her pen for a moment and looks at the wall of the room. The essay is not finished. It will not be finished today. Outside, France is still falling. She picks up the pen in The Need for Roots, the manuscript she is writing in London in the final months of her life. She attempts to translate this analysis into something approaching practical political philosophy. She argues that what is missing in the political realm is the capacity for what she calls supernatural justice, by which she does not mean magical, but something that comes from outside the logic of force, outside the self-interest of individuals and collectives, outside the calculations of power. The justice she is describing is not achievable by political means alone, because political means are themselves embedded in the logic of force. The escape from that condition requires the transformation of the soul that her spiritual writing describes, the decreation that makes genuine attention possible, the suspension of the self's claim on the world that allows the reality of the other's suffering to actually register. These are not political acts in the ordinary sense, but they are, she insists, the foundation on which any genuine justice must be built. She knew this was an uncomfortable position. It made her useful to no movement and suspicious to several. She had known this since the factory year, and she had not modified the analysis to make it more comfortable. The documents she was producing in the London months, the ones the organisation she was working for did not ask for and would not fully know what to do with, were the ones that would still be read 80 years later. The ones the organisation wanted were not. Outside the window, London was moving through the particular suspended time of a city, preparing for the next thing. She did not know how little time she had to finish what she was working on, but she was writing as though she did. Chapter 9. London, 1943. The Last Argument. London. Spring into summer, into August of 1943. The offices at Carlton Gardens had their own rhythm by the spring of 1943. The specific rhythm of an organisation that has been running long enough to have developed routines and informal hierarchies, and the particular social texture of people who have been thrown together by circumstances outside their control, and have been making the best of it ever since. Simone did not fit the rhythm easily. She was valued by the people, honest enough to say so, because her analytical intelligence was of an order that even the people who found her personally difficult could not dismiss. When she was asked to produce an analysis, what she produced was better than what anyone else would have produced. More rigorous, more honest about its own limitations, more willing to follow the argument to conclusions that were uncomfortable but accurate. She was also, by the spring of 1943, visibly unwell, in a way that had moved from concerning to alarming. The thinness that had characterized her since the factory years had progressed into something different in character, a progressive deterioration rather than a stable condition. She was coughing. The headaches that had been a feature of her life since childhood were now constant and severe. Her colleagues noticed. The people in the building noticed. The landlady at the boarding house noticed. They said something. She listened with complete attention and continued. Her position was consistent, and she had articulated it clearly to the people who asked directly. She would not eat more than the people of occupied France were eating. The German occupation had reduced the food available to the French civilian population to rations calculated to maintain the minimum functioning of a labour force. She was in London in relative comfort, working for the organisation whose purpose was the liberation of those people. She believed she must not eat well while they could not. This was not a theatrical gesture. She was not making it publicly. She was not seeking recognition for it. It was a private practice that was, in her own understanding of it, continuous with everything she had written about attention and decreation, and the inadequacy of sympathy that does not cost the sympathizer anything. Her colleague, Maurice Schumann, who had known her since before the war and who was one of the most recognized voices of the free French broadcasts on the BBC, argued with her about this directly. He understood the argument she was making. He did not think it was wrong in principle. He thought it was doing serious damage to her health, and that the organisation and France needed her to be alive and working rather than to be making a private gesture that no one outside a small circle would ever know about. She listened to him carefully, as she listened to everyone carefully, and she explained, with equal patience, why she understood the situation differently. In the spring of 1943, a doctor who examined her identified tuberculosis. The disease had been establishing itself in her lungs for some time before it was identified, moving in the way of something that has been given space to work, before anyone thought to look for it. She was told she needed rest and adequate nutrition. The physician was direct about the seriousness of the situation. She received the information with the same quality of attention she brought to everything else. She continued not to rest or eat in the ways that had been specified. She was moved in August of 1943 to Grosvenor Sanatorium in Ashford, in the county of Kent. The sanatorium specialised in the treatment of tuberculosis, which in 1943 was treated primarily through rest and nutrition and fresh air, because the antibiotic treatments that would transform the prognosis of the disease were not yet in general clinical use. The treatment required cooperation from the patient, It required eating. It required a willingness to let the body be attended to. Simone was not cooperative in these terms. She was not, by the accounts of the staff at Ashford, an unpleasant patient. She was courteous and, when she had the energy, genuinely engaged with the people who came to talk with her in the way of someone who finds other people interesting, regardless of the circumstances of the encounter. But she would not eat beyond the amount she had decided was appropriate. And the amount she had decided was appropriate was not the amount the medical staff had determined was necessary for her recovery. The question of what was actually happening in Ashford, of what Simone understood herself to be doing in those weeks, is the question that has organised the most serious debates about her life and death since 1943, and it requires the most careful attention of anything in this account. Several things can be said with confidence. She was not confused about the connection between nutrition and survival. She had been told explicitly, and she understood. She was not operating from ignorance about the consequences of her choices. She was also not, by the accounts of everyone who spoke with her at Ashford, in a state of despair or actively expressing a wish to die. She asked for books. She asked for paper. She continued writing in the notebooks she kept beside the bed, in the small, precise hand that had filled notebooks across 2 decades of extraordinary intellectual life. She was thinking about problems she had not yet resolved. She also refused a blood transfusion. The medical records note this refusal clearly. She did not refuse on religious grounds in the way that certain traditions teach. She refused in the way of someone who had made a decision about the relationship between her body and what she understood her vocation to require, and who was not going to modify that decision because of the urgency of the people around her. However genuine their concern, the plan she had submitted to de Gaulle's organisation, the plan for frontline nurses, had been rejected. The contribution she had most wanted to make, being physically present in the places where suffering was most concentrated, had been denied. What remained was the writing, the thinking, the relentless attention to the hardest questions, and alongside it was the practice she had been developing since Assisi and Solsmes, the practice of aligning herself with the suffering of the people she could not reach any other way. She was in a hospital bed in the English countryside. France was still occupied. The people of France were still being rationed to the minimum. She was not there. She could not be there. She could not nurse them at the front line. She could do this. What this was, precisely. Whether it was a spiritual practice carried to its logical conclusion, or whether it was something that the clinical literature of the later 20th century would describe in different terms, or whether it was genuinely both of these things simultaneously, is not a question that resolves cleanly. The scholar Robert Zaretsky, in The Subversive Simone Weil, published in 2021, engages this question with more honesty than most, and concludes that the attempt to assign what happened in Ashford entirely to one category or the other is probably a mistake. What Simone was doing was, in his assessment, both things at once, and the discomfort of holding them together is closer to the truth than the comfort of reducing it to one. The notebooks were beside the bed. The fields outside the sanatorium windows were green in the August light. She kept writing. Chapter 10. The Death and What It Means. Ashford, Ghent. The 24th of August, 1943. The morning arrived the way mornings arrive in the English countryside in late August, with a light that has travelled a long way and is beginning, almost imperceptibly, to change direction toward autumn. The fields outside the sanatorium were still. The institutional routines of Grosvenor were beginning their daily movement. The nurses made their rounds. The patients who could eat were brought their breakfasts. Simone Weil had been at Grosvenor for approximately 3 weeks. She had continued writing in her notebooks until the physical capacity to do so had been taken from her by the progression of the tuberculosis and the accumulated effects of the months before Ashford. The final entries are not dramatic. They do not read like the last words of someone who knows they are last words. They read like the entries of a mind that has more work to do and is working its way through the next section of a problem that extends beyond the current page. The handwriting is less precise than the Marseille notebooks. The hand of someone whose body is failing in specific ways. But the thought, as far as it can be reconstructed, is still the thought of someone who is thinking. On the morning of the 24th, she lost consciousness. She did not regain it. At some point in the morning of the 24th of August, 1943, Simone Adolphine Weil died in Grosvenor Sanatorium in Ashford, Kent. She was 34 years old and 7 months. She had been in England for less than a year. The death certificate listed the cause of death as cardiac failure secondary to myocardial degeneration, a consequence of the tuberculosis and the malnutrition that had accompanied it. The coroner who reviewed the case added a finding that has followed her legacy ever since, a determination that the deceased had contributed to her own death through the refusal of nourishment, and that this refusal had taken place while she was under the influence of the illness. The coroner's finding was the beginning of an argument that has not ended. The word suicide, which the finding implied, is a word that does considerable damage to the understanding of what happened in Ashford if it is applied without the qualification that the historical and philosophical record demands. It is also a word that cannot be entirely set aside, because the factual core of the finding is not in dispute. She refused to eat. She refused medical interventions that might have extended her life. She did so in full knowledge of the likely consequences. She died. The question is, what kind of act this was. One way to understand it, held by many of the people who knew her best, is that she was not trying to die. She was trying to live in a specific way, aligned with the suffering of the people of occupied France, and the living of that specific way in the conditions of her illness produced her death as a consequence rather than an intention. This reading is supported by the testimony of everyone who spoke with her in Ashford, all of whom describe someone still engaged with the future, still working in her notebooks, not expressing a wish for death in any ordinary sense. A second way to understand it is that a person of her intelligence, told explicitly and repeatedly what the consequences of her choices would be, and choosing anyway, has made a decision for which intention and consequence cannot be fully separated. Not necessarily a decision she would have called a decision to die, but a decision whose outcome she could foresee and whose acceptance was itself a form of choice. A third way, proposed by the biographer Thomas Nevin and engaged carefully by Robert Zaretsky, is that the attempt to resolve this question cleanly in either direction misses the specific character of what she was doing. She had spent a lifetime choosing forms of existence that most people would consider incompatible with adequate self-preservation. The factory floor was a version of this. Spain was a version of this. The decision to remain in France under occupation as long as she did was a version of this. The Ashford months were continuous with that pattern, rather than a departure from it. Whether this pattern was a coherent spiritual practice, a manifestation of something that clinical psychology would describe in different terms, or something that was genuinely both, is a question that honest engagement with her legacy requires holding open. She was a person of genius, and she was a person who suffered in ways that were not always chosen and not always philosophical. Both things were true. The attempt to make every painful element of her life into a freely chosen spiritual discipline is a form of idealization that she would have recognized and rejected. She was too honest for that, including the posthumous kind. At the same time, the attempt to reduce what happened in Ashford to a medical event or a psychological one alone, to say simply that the illness produced distorted judgment and the distorted judgment produced the death, is inadequate to the evidence of what she was actually thinking and doing in those final weeks. The notebooks are there. The letters are there. The quality of mind, visible in both, is not the quality of mind of someone who has lost their grip on reality. It is the quality of mind of someone who is seeing with considerable clarity and making choices accordingly, even if those choices are ones that the people who loved her could not accept. She died on the 24th of August, 1943. She was buried in the Catholic section of Bybrook Cemetery in Ashford, a choice made by the people responsible for her burial because they believed, given the direction of her spiritual life, that it was what she would not have objected to. Even though she had declined to formally enter the church she was now being buried in. Her parents were in New York when the news arrived. Bernard received it with the quiet grief of a man who had always understood his daughter better than she knew and who had been afraid for her for years. Salomea received it with the specific devastation of a mother who had spent 34 years watching a child she loved with enormous intensity choose, again and again, forms of existence that put her in danger. They survived her by many years. In the years after her death, they worked with her friends and editors to preserve and make available the body of writing she had left behind. The notebooks and letters and essays distributed across multiple countries and multiple safekeepers that required years of careful work to collect and prepare for publication. This work was the last form of their attention to their daughter. The manuscripts began to arrive in Paris. They were read. They were edited. They were arranged for publication. And what happened when they were published was not what anyone had fully anticipated. The world discovered Simone Weil, not as a minor figure whose work might interest specialists, as one of the most original and important voices the 20th century had produced, a voice that had been writing in relative obscurity for its entire existence and that had left behind, in the years of mature work, enough material to sustain serious intellectual engagement for generations. She had been right about the time being limited. She had been working accordingly. The work was there. What it meant was just beginning to become clear. Chapter 11. The Afterlife of Her Ideas. Paris, 1949, and the decades that followed. Albert Camus was 35 years old when he read the manuscript of The Need for Roots in his capacity as an editor at Gallimard, the Paris publishing house, where he had been working since the liberation of France. He had known of Simone Weil before the war, had encountered her name in the circles of the French left, where she was a known and somewhat polarizing figure, too mystical for the committed Marxists, and too political for the orthodox Catholics, and too rigorous for everyone who preferred their philosophy to arrive at comfortable conclusions. He read the first pages of the manuscript and did not put it down. He arranged for its publication. He arranged for the publication of Waiting for God, the collection of letters and essays from the Marseille period that contained the fullest statement of her spiritual philosophy. He wrote a preface for the volume in which he called her the only great spirit of our time. This was not a casual compliment from a man who did not use words carelessly. Camus was himself one of the most significant French writers of the century. A Nobel laureate whose own work on suffering and absurdity and the human response to a world without guaranteed meaning placed him in direct conversation with the questions Simone had been addressing from a different direction. When he called her a great spirit, he was making a precise claim, from a position of standing, about the quality and significance of what she had produced. The publication of Waiting for God in 1951 was the moment when her posthumous life began in earnest. What happened in the following decades was not the orderly reception of a philosopher whose place in the canon was quickly established. It was something more unpredictable and more interesting. Her ideas moved in multiple directions simultaneously, finding readers across traditions that had almost nothing else in common. And the reason for this is worth understanding. She was working at the level of the questions that underlie the positions, the questions people hold in common, even when their answers diverge completely. What is the nature of suffering? What do we owe to each other? What is the connection between the inner life and the political life? How does a human being remain fully human in conditions designed to prevent it? These questions do not have party affiliations. They arrive at the foundation of human experience, and they do not go away. The concept of attention entered moral philosophy most directly through the work of Iris Murdoch, who became one of the most important British moral philosophers and novelists of the 20th century. Murdoch's argument that the capacity to see other people clearly, to attend to them as they actually are, rather than as our own needs and fears have shaped them to appear, is the foundation of genuine moral life. She draws directly from Simone's framework, acknowledges this debt explicitly, and extends it into territory Simone had not explored, bringing it into conversation with questions about consciousness and the practice of fiction. When Murdoch writes about what it means to really see another person, she is working with tools that Simone built, the concept of affliction, of malheur, and its specific destruction of the soul's sense of its own reality, moved into theology through thinkers who found in it resources that the mainstream theological tradition had not fully developed. The philosopher and theologian Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury and one of the most significant Anglican thinkers of the early 21st century, has returned to her work repeatedly across his career. In his reading, the analysis of affliction and the concept of attention together constitute a contribution to the theology of suffering that the Church has still not fully absorbed, a way of thinking about God and pain that refuses the easy answers and stays with the difficulty. T.S. Eliot, who was by 1951 one of the most significant literary and intellectual figures in the English-speaking world, arranged for the English publication of Waiting for God, and wrote an introduction to it. His introduction is more careful than Camus' preface, more alert to the difficulties in her work, alongside its extraordinary qualities. He was a committed Christian, and he read her refusal to enter the Church with a theological attention that found it both comprehensible and troubling. But he published the book, and he placed his considerable authority behind the claim that this was a writer the English-speaking world needed to encounter. The political analysis moved in yet another direction. The critique of force and the argument that power reproduces oppression, regardless of who holds it, found readers in liberation theology, movements who were working through the same problems from the inside of specific political situations. Her insistence that genuine justice requires a transformation of the soul that politics alone cannot produce was not, in these contexts, a counsel of passivity. It was a diagnosis of why revolutions that did not address the interior dimension of the people making them tended to reproduce what they had set out to dismantle. The writer, Susan Sontag, one of the most significant American cultural critics of the second half of the 20th century, wrote about Simone with a combination of fascination and ambivalence that itself illuminates something important about how the work operates. Sontag was drawn to the uncompromising quality of Simone's commitments and also genuinely troubled by it, alive to the possibility that an uncompromising commitment to self-denial was not entirely distinguishable from a kind of spiritual violence against the self. This ambivalence is not a failure of understanding. It is the appropriate response to work that is genuinely difficult and genuinely double-edged. And it suggests that Sontag was reading Simone the way Simone would have wanted to be read, with full attention and without the protective softening of uncritical admiration. What is striking, looking across the range of thinkers who have been formed by her work, is that they represent positions that have almost nothing else in common. Marxists and Catholics, pacifists and people who believe in just war, existentialists and mystical theologians, feminist scholars and conservative social philosophers. She does not fit comfortably into any of these categories, and each has found in her work something that speaks to their deepest concerns. This breadth is not accidental. It is a function of where she was working, at the level of the foundational questions, rather than at the level of the answers. The answers divide people. The questions, when they are the right questions asked with sufficient depth and honesty, bring people into a different kind of conversation. The complete critical edition of her collected works, published in French by Gallimard, runs to 15 volumes. The English translations, produced across several decades by multiple translators, have made the major texts available to readers who do not read French. Though translations of philosophically precise writing always carry the limitations of the gap between languages, in France she became, over the decades after her death, part of the vocabulary that the culture uses to think with. In the English-speaking world, the reception has been more intermittent, arriving in waves as different communities discover her at different moments, finding in the same body of work different things that the moment they are living in has made necessary. She has been read by people in crisis, and people in comfort, and people trying to understand what the crisis of others means, and what it requires of them. She has been read in hospitals, and in seminaries, and in political science departments, and in the private notebooks of people who are trying to find words for something they have experienced but cannot name. The sentences she wrote in the cold room in London, and the farmhouse in the Ardèche, and the apartment in Marseille, are still doing what good sentences do. They are finding the people who need them. She would not have wanted to be celebrated for this. She would have wanted the attention she was pointing at to become real in the lives of the people who encountered her work. Whether it has is not a question that can be answered by looking at the publication history or the critical reception. It can only be answered by the person reading. Chapter 12. Why She Still Matters. The Uncomfortable Questions. Think of the room in Ashford where we began this night. August of 1943. The fields outside the window, turning slowly toward autumn. The notebooks beside the bed. The 34 years of a life that had moved from a cold apartment in Paris to factory floors and battlefields in Spain, and chapels in Assisi, and monasteries in Solesmes, and finally to this small room in the English countryside where the Camos, tuberculosis, and the months of inadequate eating were reaching their conclusion. She knew. Not approximately. Not in the vague way that people sometimes know things they prefer not to fully confront. She knew with the specific clarity of a philosopher who had spent 20 years thinking about the relationship between the body and the soul and the conditions under which suffering becomes the thing she called malheur. She knew what was happening, and she continued anyway. The question this raises is not simple, and any account of her life that resolves it too quickly, in either direction, is not doing her the courtesy of genuine attention. One direction says she was practicing what she believed all the way to its conclusion, that the decreation she had been describing for years was the act she was performing, that what looks from outside like self-destruction was from inside a form of the attention and alignment with suffering that her philosophy had always pointed toward. This reading honours the coherence of her thought and the seriousness of her commitment. The other direction says that whatever the philosophical framework, a 34-year-old woman was dying of a preventable combination of malnutrition and tuberculosis, and that the framework which explained her choices to herself was also, in some dimension, she may not have been fully equipped to see, a framework that made it possible to continue choices whose consequences she could not afford. This reading honours the complexity of her humanity and refuses the comfort of converting every painful thing into a freely chosen spiritual discipline. Both readings are honest. Both are necessary. The tension between them is not a problem to be resolved. It is the truth. And this truth, held without resolution, has things to say to the world of the early 21st century that are considerably more useful than either direction of resolution on its own. Begin with malheur, the concept she developed in the Marseille years, the affliction that destroys not just the body, but the soul's sense of its own reality, its own right to exist, its own claim on the attention of the world, is not a historical curiosity. It is a description of something happening in the present world with a frequency that our existing frameworks are inadequate to address. The clinical literature on trauma that has developed in the decades since her death has converged, in certain respects, on something she was describing from a different direction. The specific damage that occurs when suffering is combined with social invisibility. When a person experiences not only pain, but the systematic failure of the surrounding world to register that pain as the pain of a full human being, is something that trauma research describes with increasing precision. She got to this description decades earlier, from philosophy and direct experience rather than from clinical observation, and she got to dimensions of it that the clinical literature has still not fully reached, particularly the spiritual dimension. The way that this kind of damage affects not just the psychology, but the soul's relationship to its own existence. Her framework helps us think about why material improvements in the conditions of suffering, however necessary, are sometimes not sufficient to address what the suffering has done. Why a person who has been lifted out of poverty or violence can still be carrying the specific damage of malheur, because the material conditions are only part of what malheur is. The social dimension, the experience of having been treated as someone whose reality does not fully count, does not automatically resolve when the material conditions improve. It requires what Simone describes as genuine attention, someone actually asking and actually staying with the answer before it can begin to shift. This is one reason her concept of attention remains urgently relevant. In a world where the mechanisms for capturing human attention have been refined to a degree she could not have specifically anticipated, where the architecture of the digital environment most people now inhabit is organized around the fragmentation and redirection of attention toward commercially valuable ends, her description of what genuine attention actually is and what it requires stands in a kind of productive opposition to almost everything the surrounding culture is producing. What the attention economy produces is not attention in her sense. It is its simulation. The distracted, fragmented, constantly interrupted engagement with a succession of stimuli is the antithesis of the complete, receptive, selfless openness she is describing. In Simone's terms, the algorithm begins to look like gravity. It pulls everything toward the self's appetites and the system's interests, and away from the genuine encounter with another person's reality that she understood as the foundation of love and justice. Her framework helps us think about why genuine connection feels so difficult in an era of unprecedented connectivity. Why the experience of being truly seen by another person has become so rare and so powerful that its occurrence can feel almost shocking. Why the performance of attention, which the digital environment rewards and produces in enormous quantities, leaves people feeling more alone rather than less. She was not writing about these specific technologies. She was writing about the structure of the soul and the conditions under which genuine encounter with reality becomes possible. The technologies change. The structure does not. Then there is the political dimension, which has not lost any of its difficulty in the 80 years since she was writing. Her argument that genuine justice requires something that politics alone cannot provide, that the transformation of the soul that makes genuine attention possible is the foundation on which structural change must be built rather than an alternative to it, remains the most uncomfortable and the most important thing, she said. It is uncomfortable because it cannot be converted into a program or a policy or a set of institutional reforms. It is important because the history of the decades since her death has continued to demonstrate, with a consistency she would have found unsurprising, that structural change without interior transformation tends to reproduce what it set out to dismantle, in new forms and with new justifications. This is not a counsel of passivity. She would have been the first to insist on the necessity of the structural work. The factory floor was real. The colonial exploitation was real. The specific conditions that produced malheur in specific people were produced by specific structures that could be changed and that should be changed. She spent her life arguing for those changes and demonstrating through her own choices what taking them seriously actually cost. What she also spent her life arguing is that the people doing the arguing, the people organizing and advocating and fighting for change, are not exempt from the gravity she describes. That the movement which cannot attend to its own tendency toward the logic of force carries that tendency forward into whatever it builds. That the activist, whose concern for justice is organized, more than they know, around their own need to be on the right side, is doing something less than genuine attention. However correct their analysis, she turned this analysis on herself with the same rigor she turned it on everyone else. This is part of what makes it credible. Now, with all of this held, the philosophy and the life and the question of Ashford that will not resolve, what does she actually leave? She leaves the concept of malheur, the most precise description produced in the 20th century of a specific form of human suffering that our other frameworks do not fully reach. She leaves the concept of attention, the most demanding and the most necessary practice she could describe, and the most direct opposition to the simulation of attention that the surrounding culture produces in industrial quantities. She leaves the critique of force and the great beast, the most honest account she could give of why power tends to reproduce oppression regardless of who holds it, and why the tools required to resist this tendency are not primarily political tools. She leaves the need for roots, the most serious diagnosis produced in the 20th century of what happens to human beings when the particular, embodied, local forms of meaning that sustain them are destroyed, and the most honest account of what rebuilding them would actually require. And she leaves the question of her own life, which is not a question that can be answered cleanly, and which she would not have wanted answered cleanly. She would have wanted it held with the same quality of attention she tried to bring to everything. A girl in a Paris apartment, 14 years old, deciding whether her existence was worth the cost, and arriving at the conclusion that what mattered was not the power of the mind, but the quality of its attention. A young woman on a factory floor in the 15th arrondissement, learning in her body what she had been theorizing in her mind. The systematic denial of inner life, the impossibility of sustained thought in the rhythm of the machine. A volunteer on the Aragon front, stepping into a pot of boiling oil, and watching the logic of violence transform people she believed in. A person on her knees in a chapel in Assisi, not knowing why and not able to explain it. In a moment she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe with the precision she brought to everything. A philosopher in a cold room in London, writing in the early morning hours, filling notebooks with the most important work of her life. While the city outside began its day, and the war continued, and the time available grew shorter than anyone around her knew. And finally, the room in Ashford, the notebooks beside the bed, the August light on the fields outside the window, the 34 years concluding in the specific way they concluded, which was not clean and not comfortable and not reducible to a single explanation, and which she would have wanted us to hold without reducing. What she left is what she always had, the quality of her attention to the hardest questions, and the insistence, maintained at a cost most people are not willing to pay, that those questions deserve that quality of attention rather than the comfortable version of them. She would not have wanted to be mourned. She would have wanted the attention she was pointing at to become real in the life of the person who encountered her work. That is the only memorial she would have found adequate to what she was trying to say. The notebook is open. The question is on the page. It is waiting for the quality of attention it deserves. And it is entirely within your reach, wherever you are tonight, whatever you are carrying into the dark. Sleep well.